welcome for all of you. This is the second day of the EUI Asia launching event, the EU, Japan, and a fraying international order. This panel focuses on NATO, EU, East Asia, and especially disinformation. We have assembled the one of the most the able team of the professors, including first Professor Neville Bolt at King's College London, Dr. Aurelio Insisa, Hong Kong University, and Professor Chiyuki Aoi at University of Tokyo. And we have asked Dr. Peter Bush at King's College London to comment on these three papers. We will start from Professor Bolt's presentation on the generally on this disinformation phenomena, and later on go on to analyze the sort of front line of this information in East Asia, Taiwan, which will be made by Professor Insisa. And then later on, moving on to the wider region of Indo-Pacific to be made by Professor Aoi. Now, Professor Bolt, could you take the floor, please? Each speaker has 10 minutes for the initial presentation. Please keep the time. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I discuss the relationship between strategic communications and disinformation in geopolitics, I'll explain both terms. Then I'll suggest why our understanding of disinformation has become too narrow during what's been called the long decade of disinformation. Strategic communications entails the long-term shaping and shifting of significant discourses in societies. It's the projection of foreign and security policies aimed at changing the attitudes and behavior of targeted audiences to achieve strategic effects using words, images, actions, and non-actions in the national interest or the interest of a political community. Strategic communications means more than communicating strategically. It is strategic because it focuses discourse change on the long term. It is strategic because it navigates a dynamic and contested information environment. It is strategic because tactics should be coherent and consistent within a strategy that evolves when the rubber of the planners hits the friction of the road. Strategic communications forms the crossroads of two axes. One, persuasion and coercion. Two, authority and legitimacy. Persuasion, soft power if you like, the ability to attract and appeal through one's values, stretching to hard power, coercion, the threat to use force. This is no simple binary. Strategic communications constantly calibrates between these two cross axes. And disinformation plays its part in this set of tensions. Disinformation is associated with malevolence and disruption, not a force for good. It's rapidly being turned into a new disinformationism. Is it not better to understand it through nuanced truth-telling and untruth-telling, truth and lies, part and parcel of human nature and politics and geopolitics? If we separate out malevolent information in politics, here are 4 ways of prefixing information with negative consequences. Disinformation, the deliberate attempt to subvert the political status quo using erroneous information. Misinformation, accidental or unwitting passing on of erroneous information. Malinformation, the outing of personal information meant to harm the victim. And non-information, the failure to supply evidential information in a political contest. So how does disinformation impact strategic communications? Strategic communications emerges post 9/11 with the perceived failure of Western military incursions into Afghanistan and Iraq, and following Russia's annexation of Crimea and Donbas, Ukraine. Where kinetic policies had failed, informational dominance, the West concluded, might be more effective. Wind down coercion, wind up persuasion. It arises alongside the contested concept of hybrid warfare. Hybridity argues we're witnessing a new form of conducting war using all state assets, where information is privileged. That fits into the familiar dime lens: diplomacy, information, military, and economic, which in turn speaks to NATO's terminology working group that sees strategic communications as a holistic approach to communication based on values and interests that encompasses everything an actor does to achieve strategic objectives in a contested environment. So it's consistent with debates around gray zone, fusion doctrine, and whole of government approach. These values are taken to be liberal democratic, not authoritarian. Disinformation is widely read as coming from authoritarian sources. Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. The problem is, we need a more profound understanding of disinformation in its multiple guises. Disinformation originates internally and externally in societies. Both may or may not work in tandem. Internally, Western politicians in liberal and illiberal democracies also disseminate erroneous information. Externally, I'll focus on three: Russia, China, and ISIS. And ISIS hasn't gone away, by the way. Russia uses disinformation systematically and industrially in its foreign and security policies to disrupt and subvert through confusion. Releasing multiple conflicting stories to explain events, to sow confusion, and undermine the political status quo of targeted nation states. Many of those stories are absurd. Some are mildly conceivable. These stories aim to sow doubt and dissent, exploit cracks in Western societies, fragment consensus, and drive apart targeted communities by reinforcing competing opinions with erroneous facts. It is a form of strategic opportunism. In Britain, when former double agent Sergei Skripal was poisoned by two officers of Russia's GRU, 40 different explanations followed, disseminated by Moscow and St. Petersburg via social media platforms, crossing into traditional media while receiving generous airtime on RT Russia Today. China's information strategy is different. Disinformation is less strategic subversion, more strategic ambiguity. At best, disingenuous, at worst, deceitful. There are two prongs to China's information policies, soft and hard. The Belt and Road Initiative, with its Asia-Europe land route, South China Sea, India Ocean Sea route, and Polar Arctic Sea route, signals friendship and partnership. President Xi announced a 900 billion project, claiming it would embrace half the people on Earth, close to 3 billion people, and represent the biggest market in the world with unparalleled potential. The biggest public diplomacy project of modernity, Xi promises economic prosperity for all along its routes and currency stability on world markets. It dwarfs America's public diplomacy Marshall Plan in the late 1940s. Meanwhile, China projects force. It lays claim to the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, challenges Japan around the Senkaku Islands, militarizes disputed sandbanks, threatening Japanese sovereignty. It rejects international court rulings favoring the Philippines over the 9-dash line. It extinguishes Hong Kong's democracy. It incarcerates Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps. It annexes Tibet, and it would restore Taiwan to Beijing's control. By creating a cognitive dissonance in Western minds, is this where strategic ambiguity plays into a richer understanding of disinformation? ISIS is a non-state actor with state-centric ambitions. Al-Qaeda has no interest in sovereignty. Both produce and westernize disinformation. They tell lies. They distort history and how their faith is taught. They infiltrate audiences openly and by stealth, targeting vulnerable communities. That's not how they see it. Theirs is the truth. Theirs are the values. Theirs is a black and white view of the world, presented in information campaigns without equivocation. ISIS allows you to be outwardly Western, inwardly Muslim, but fundamentalist, militant, anti-Western. Russia projects multiple stories without favor, subversion through confusion. China presents its confusing story through opposing messages. Everyone's a winner versus winner takes all, yet frames itself holding the moral high ground. Finally, what they share is the use of disinformation strategies to exploit fundamental cracks in Western democratic societies. Fault lines emerge from the West's embrace of postmodern thinking with its moral equivalence, from a loss of self-confidence due to diverse causes, perceived failure of foreign military expeditions to promote liberal democracy, failure to deal equitably with the fallout from the 2008 global economic crisis, all emotionally driven by instantaneous interconnectivity via our smartphones. And so if the West felt more self-confident in its values, disinformation would have little effect on its stability. Strategic communicators need to rethink disinformation as something bigger, more complex than simply Russian disinformation and dirty tricks. In strategic communications, we ask the question, is it a mindset, a process, or is it a set of techniques or tactics? We should ask the same of disinformation. Is it mindset, process, or tactics? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Professor Bolt. You started from this conceptual clarification and went on to show the different models across the countries and entities, and ended with the question how to deal with this phenomenon depending on the aspects or phases of this strategic communication. Thank you very much indeed. Now we move on to the Taiwanese case. Aurelio, could you take the floor, please?
Good morning, everyone in Europe, and good afternoon to all of us here in Asia. So the paper I'm presenting here today examines Taiwanese strategic communications during the Tsai Ing-wen administration, so between 2016 and 2020 specifically. And I'm examining a specific type, a specific strand of strategic communications in this paper, the strategic communications of the Tsai administration own techno-democratic agenda. So I know it's a bit heavy on jargon here, so I would like to start with what we mean with techno-democratic statecraft, techno-democratic agenda. I think we could define it as an approach to statecraft that combines forward-looking, cyber domain-focused, national security-oriented technology and industrial policy with the championing of liberal democratic values both at home and abroad. So it's broadly an attempt to craft a counterpart to what voices critical of Beijing in recent years have been defining as a new paradigm of digital authoritarianism. Now, the interesting thing is what is the main driver behind this emergence of the emergence of a techno-democratic agenda? And I would say that the main driver is the perception by the Tsai administration, the Democratic Progressive Party, pan-green actors in Taiwan, that Chinese attempts to unifications will eventually be performed either via winning without fighting strategy or as an anticipation to an actual kinetic confrontation through two main channels. The first one is a deterioration of the island's information environment in Taiwan, something that has to be achieved via dissemination of disinformation both within the island and outside the island, and also the co-optation of cash-strapped traditional media on Taiwan, so television channels and newspapers. And the second one, as mentioned by Dr. Duchatel yesterday, the ability to perform cyber attacks to critical digital infrastructures on the island. Now, it's important to keep in mind, of course, that Beijing flatly denies any kind of involvement in these activities, but this is the perception that exists in Taiwan. And the Tsai administration has tried to articulate since 2016 this agenda, this techno-democratic response, we could say, in three ways. The first one is to favor to industrial and technology policy, the establishment of, let's say, free and secure cutting-edge digital infrastructures on the island. The second one is a systematic setting up of a legal and regulatory cordon sanitaire, sanitary cordon around the island against malign information, external interference. And finally, the third one, I think is probably the most interesting, is the attempt to foster, digital media literacy among the population in the hope that this would turn the majority of Taiwanese people impermeable to disinformation from outside and from within the island. Now, I think it's important to think about the actual objectives that this kind of strategic communication aims to achieve. Obviously, the most obvious one is to structure foreign attitudes and foreign perceptions of Taiwan in a favorable manner that would eventually guarantee the international support for the continuing de facto autonomy of the island vis-a-vis Beijing. But there are also, of course, some more contingent objectives. The most immediate, as I think will be clear by the end of the presentation, was the attempt to let Taiwan join again the World Health Assembly in the case of the pandemic. But there are also more of the same short to medium term objectives, specifically the strategic communication of techno-democratic statecraft aims at signaling to friendly countries such as the United States and Japan the Tsai administration's own endorsement of the free and open Indo-Pacific agenda. This in turn has aims at achieving two different things. In the case of Japan, I believe that it aims at facilitating current and quite difficult negotiations to join the Tokyo-led CPTPP. Regional free trade agreement. In the case of the United States, it has definitely to do with the attempt to sign a bilateral free trade agreement, but more broadly, I would say also with the attempt to deepen economic ties with the United States in a context of Sino-American decoupling, but also of a reshoring of Taiwanese business from the mainland. And we should also take into consideration, for example, companies such as Google and Microsoft moving to Hong Kong in very recent years. Now, I will briefly try to outline the phases through which this type of strategic communication has been articulated since 2016. I would say that in the first 2 years in power of the administration, this was mostly a domestic discourse. That it wasn't really tooled towards foreign audiences, partially because the structure, the infrastructure for the techno-democratic statecraft was still had to build, but at the same time also because I would say there was an absence of meaningful avenues to disseminate these strategic communications abroad, this type of strategic communications abroad. The crucial shift, I think, happens between late 2017 and early 2018. And this has to do with the contemporary further deterioration of cross-strait relations, so the relation between Beijing and Taipei, and at the same time, the beginning of the path that will lead the Trump administration and Beijing to the trade war. So there is I would say that there is a direct correlation between the two. And indeed, the main vector of this strand of strategic communications starting in 2018 has been a Taiwanese American platform that is the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. So this is a very specific platform, one that is designed for epistemic communities and professional networks, not really for the general public at the beginning. And the GCTF at the beginning was established by the Obama administration and the Ma Ying-jeou administration in 2015. And the aim was simply to provide an alternative platform for Taiwanese public officials and private sectors to engage with the American counterparts. But by 2018, if we take a look at the agenda of the various workshops that are held within this framework, we see that there is an actual retooling towards the free and open Indo-Pacific agenda and a welding of the themes of techno-democratic statecraft that emerged in Taiwan. I would say even since the beginning of since the Sunflower Movement of 2014, with the typical narratives of the free and open Indo-Pacific. What is even more interesting is that starting from 2019, the GCTF assumes, I would say, a semi-quad setup, because Japan joins the GCTF as a full member of the program, and then last year Australia started to join the program also as a regular guest. So actually, basically now I would say the GCTF is almost becoming an informal platform for Taiwan to maintain contacts with Quad countries, even though of course India is still absent. At the same time, I will also signal that by 2018 we have the intensification of the role of the now, I would say, globally famous digital minister of Taiwan, Audrey Tang, in disseminating narratives over the reinvention of democracy through digital democracy that is occurring in Taiwan right now. And Audrey Tang has been able to do that with a sustained engagement with Western media. Western media play a fundamental role in this type of strategic communications. And now to conclude, I'll move to COVID and the role of the pandemic in it. Because this is the actual phase where this type of strategic communication goes public, becomes well known all outside of professional communities and government officials. And here I would open a small parenthesis. I would say that the widely uneven paths in the containment of the pandemic across the world have triggered a global search for models and for solutions, especially in the period before the rollout of the vaccines. And this creates an ideal environment for the dissemination of strategic communications, especially in the case of Taiwan, that has been able to pack its own experience, to create a package of its own experience, and sell it as the so-called Taiwanese model, the democratic Taiwanese model of excellence and transparency in fighting the virus. That is clearly construed as an alternative to the Chinese response, as it has been perceived quite as a quite authoritarian response, especially in the West. And this indeed is the core of the Taiwan Can Help campaign. There is a composite campaign that has been launched in April 2020. The core of the campaign technically should be was the gift of medical material to 80 countries at a moment where the procurement of surgical masks and ventilators was particularly difficult at the very beginning of the pandemic in Europe. But in fact, these gifts were the vectors through which the narratives were disseminated among Western media. So you have, for example, President Tsai Ing-wen being on the cover of Time magazine, and Audrey Tang basically being on all major media in the West, presenting, championing this new Taiwanese model. And the narratives around the model really focus on digitally powered whole of society response, both to logistic challenges that emerge with the pandemic, and this is where disinformation becomes very important. Also, a bottom-up response to disinformation, what is called generally infodemic or pandemic-related disinformation. And maybe I could go into details about these things in the Q&A. So, to conclude, I would say that in doing so, specifically with the narratives that have been established with the Taiwan Can Help campaign, we really see fleshed out the nexus between the performance of digital democracy and the need for free and secure digital infrastructures. This is where techno-democratic statecraft comes of age. And finally, I would say that these experiences, the Taiwanese experiences, especially in the last 3 years, since 2018, are meaningful, I would say, in the context of our panel at least, because they show how the practice of strategic information by a liberal democratic polity, such as Taiwan, can adapt to great power competition in the region, in the Asia-Pacific, to the capillary diffusion of disinformation in an information environment, such as the Taiwanese one, and finally also about sees the impact of adapts to the impact, to the disruptive impact of technological development on the performance of democracy, on the processes of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aurelio, for analyzing the state of techno-democratic statecraft of Taiwan, its sources, agenda, and fora of this spectacular phenomenon in this changing environment, starting from the US-China deterioration and the COVID-19. Thank you very much indeed, and also keeping your time. Let's go straight into the debating phase, and the Dr. Peter Bush, could you comment, say, in 15 minutes, please? Thank you.
Yes, many thanks. Many thanks also to Chiyuki, Aurelio, and Neville for your papers, offering fascinating insights into importance, the vulnerabilities, but also the opportunities of the political communication environment in East Asia. So I'd like to use the time allocated to me, and I hope I will be able to stay well under 15 minutes to give the speakers and participants plenty of room to debate and discuss. So I would like to use the few minutes to highlight a few things under the broad headings of vulnerabilities and opportunities, and formulate some questions for our speakers in this context. So I think we can look at the main players involved, and this became clear in both Aurelio's and Chiyuki's papers. To put it deliberately crude here, they are the big powers, China and the United States, the former the challenger, even enemy, if you want to use the term in Taiwan's case, and the latter the most important friend and ally. And then there is the EU, important in terms of values and perhaps also more than economic strength, yet keen to remain, one could perhaps say, pragmatic in its relations to China. And in this broader view, and this is important for communication strategies, they see the growing economic and military strength of China as a challenge to the status quo, to how things are, which they are, broadly speaking, I mean, the US and others are okay with. And this is worth remembering in the context of strategic communications. Taiwan, Japan, and also the US and the EU basically enter this from a defensive position. And you mentioned the various aspects here when it comes to communication. They are concerned, they see a challenge, and the question is how to react. This is at least how they perceive the situation to a large extent. This concern of being on the defensive is often a problem, but it does not preclude Taiwan and Japan, as we said, to be proactive. And this is where I found Chiyuki's discussion particularly interesting and insightful, the discussion of Abe's Indo-Pacific vision. This is, I think, a very good example of shaping, which Chiyuki, of course, mentioned as well, using ideas and talking about them to mold the strategic environment. And defining space, and therefore what is at stake, is a crucial aspect here. Establishing this vision and getting buy-in from other nations in adopting first the language, and with that the vision, one could argue is a crucial aspect of successful strategic communication activity. At the heart of this vision, to stay with the Indo-Pacific, is the move to widen the problem area. So Japan, and that would be true for Taiwan as well, need to define the challenge they face very near to their shores in broader terms, because in their direct proximity, China is just so overwhelmingly strong. So broadening the lens makes China smaller, seemingly more manageable. And this is where alliances, diplomatic and military relations come in. And I think Geoffrey gave us a very good idea of how this also works in defense communication. You mentioned joint naval exercises, and here's a footnote. The National Defense Program guidelines in Japan are, in their very formulation, create, deter, counter, a very important aspect of strategic communication. So telling the world what your defense is about. Anyway, as myself, I'm always interested in narratives. I would like to know more about how the Indo-Pacific narrative from Japan's perspective would be formulated in the future. How can it be expanded on? I mean, what kind of concrete stories you could tell, and maybe you can say something about this later. Staying with the theme of opportunities, the Taiwan case is very interesting indeed. And this is, of course, also related to the issue of values Chiyuki talked about. And that is the challenge of perhaps malign state actors are behind this, the challenge that the information space is, and this is part of the challenge, particularly in disinformation and undermining what is underpinning liberal democracies, the free exchange of ideas and rational, meaningful debate. And Neville, of course, explained what disinformation can be about in various forms, and pitting another vision of technological opportunity here from Taiwan's point of view, a vision that is potentially the opposite of digital authoritarianism, which is used to maintaining and strengthening one-party rule in China. So the story is that Taiwan first has to demonstrate to its friends and the world that it has established expertise, deliberately established expertise in cybersecurity. Communicating this is not without problems, as talking about cybersecurity always also points to your own vulnerabilities. So the move here for Taiwan is to demonstrate its commitment to the Western world, or liberal democracies, its resistance to Chinese and other challenges, as well as its usefulness as a country that can contribute to the defense of liberal democracies against authoritarian challenges. And what Taiwan is doing here is somehow similar to what we saw in the Baltic states when they faced Russian challenges, I think. Cyber and information more than a decade ago. It is no accident, after all, that NATO's Center for Excellence in Cybersecurity and Strategic Communications are based in Estonia and Latvia. I never would know much more about this than me. But where does strategic communication come in here in concrete terms? It is, first of all, remarkable that whenever we talk about the new communication space, new challenges, we still focus, and perhaps need to focus, on established patterns of how to organize persuasive communication. On the one hand, Aurelio's paper highlights institutions and organizations. And also one interesting platform mentioned was the Global Cooperation and Training Framework that brings together officials and important players, basically elites from Taiwan and the US. And to come back to what I said earlier, and I thought it was interesting to see the discussion of the Indo-Pacific in this forum as well. So it's communicating to elite audiences. That seems to be one of the major target audiences we're talking here about here when it comes to strategic communication. So institutionalizing communication is nothing new, as I said, so it's an established pattern. Another established thing, and I think a striking example is this very simple one, the simple slogan, Taiwan can help, mentioned in the context of COVID. But the wider purpose is that it demonstrates, of course, the usefulness of Taiwan to the international community, its role in the world, its rightful place in the world community, be it World Health Organizations or similar aspects there. It makes it all the more difficult for the United States and others then to ignore Taiwan and its desire to maintain the status quo, its independence. And then finally, there's the focus on I like this one, on one communicator, Audrey Tang, that you mentioned. And I think we should really stop and think about this, the personalization of communication. One face when communicating, one person that does become known to journalists in liberal democracies, a person that is on message, of course, and promotes Taiwan's narrative. And this in the whole techno, innovative, whatever kind of cyberspace is, of course, a very real and embodied version of strategic communication. And that we shouldn't forget about it. It's interesting to highlight. Another point here, and that would lead to a question I would have for Aurelio. The Trump administration, and that's a claim in your paper also, with which I would agree, provided an opening for Taiwan. So with Trump standing up to China, if you want to put it like this, so while Trump certainly stood for more assertive position vis-a-vis China, his administration and his talk of fake news and challenging established US journalistic practices, of course, is another story. So how does Taiwan, or how did Taiwan, maybe it's different now, was trying or is trying to address disinformation campaigns? How do Taiwanese officials really use the term fake news, for example, in this context? Did they use the term like Trump does or did? Or should I say, were they more flexible, addressing different audiences when they used the term in a different way? I think it's, for me, an interesting question here. Which leads to my final point. I'm glad I think I can stay under 15 minutes. Excellent. And that is rather a big and broad term, and this is the point. This is about the term digital democracy. What does it really mean in this context? Is the very focus on digital democracy not also an expression of a deep uncertainty about democratic practices in Western Europe, the United States and other democratic countries as well? So this deep uncertainty that is maybe in all of us, or in many of us. Is it realistic, though, that the EU, when we now think about Taiwan example, that the EU and the US and Japan even consider finding it appropriate to look for examples of the use of digital technology in other countries, in places like Taiwan, in this context? Would they find it believable to do it? Yes, potentially when it comes to defense and fighting against more or less clear-cut cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. But what role do broader issues of controlling the digital world play in democratic debates? Where are the limits for freedom of expression? Would any of these liberal democracies I mentioned, in the US in particular, would they feel prepared to look for inspiration in these fields elsewhere? Don't these very fundamental aspects of societal organization, political organizations, the very essence of one's political system, would they not have to be agreed and negotiated upon from bottom up within the country? And this is also where you might find a challenge. To what extent do you want to say, oh, we're so brilliant at this and you better do the same, which could be a difficult message to get across. But I think I should stop here. Thank the speakers again for their contributions, and let you and maybe some audience questions also leave room for questions and more spirited debate. But thanks a lot again. I really enjoyed your papers.
Right, thank you very much indeed to pose various questions starting from conceptual to practical. Now, I would like to ask each speaker to respond, say 3 minutes perhaps, and then after that we open up to the audience, and we can perhaps have some time to discuss a little bit more in the remaining time. Now, in order of speaking, Professor Volt, could you start by responding any aspects of the comments, or perhaps other speakers' presentation, if you like?
Yes, okay. Thank you. So I think there are concerns within the world of strategic communications anyway. Fundamental concerns which go to something that Chiuki raised before, which was the tension between constructive and reactive shaping of discourses, to the extent that the concern, certainly in Western societies and in Western governments, albeit that governments prefer not to talk about it so much, is that we are finding ourselves in a period where states are reacting to events, that the focus is on the tactical. And okay, I'm also referring to before the period of COVID, which clearly in the West was a highly reactive. And in fact, research that we're doing at the moment in parts of Europe highlight the point that really what COVID brought out was not even reactive communications, but crisis communications, you know, which is almost antithetical to the idea of strategic communications. Because the tactics frequently undermine the long-term values of strategic communications is trying to actually infuse into societies. So there's a natural tension there. I think the concept of space, I think, is important. Defining space, I think, is really, really important. And I think it goes hand in hand, actually, with defining finding a kind of temporal understanding as well. So defining time and space, because there is also a tendency on the part of many to think that strategic communications is just a powder. You boil the kettle, you add the water, you stir it, and suddenly you have it. In fact, strategic communications is a long-term build, not just into the future, but out of the past. And it is a matter of trying to tell the story of the past. This, of course, entails repositioning the past, which is happening all the time. That's naturally what states do for a living. But it is a matter of trying to take on what the story of the past is, in order to, in a sense, as the storyteller, to claim some kind of control over the present in order to legitimize one's position, one's role in the future. So that the shaping of space goes hand in hand with the shaping of time as well. They belong to each other. And I believe that's the case. Well, it's the case with many, many states. But here we're also talking about Japan. And it naturally, therefore, goes to the whole question in Japan of what is strategic communications? To what extent can Japan embrace the kinetic aspect of strategic communications? Or does it have to really, really stay confined to what we would essentially call public diplomacy? Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Aurelio, please.
Yes, Peter, if I may. I think that overall, there are two questions that I can unpack your comments into questions. The first one regarding how does the whole Trump drama relates to the strategic communications of Taiwan, and the second one, the actual appeal of digital democracy, if I understood correctly your comments. And in regards to the Trump administration, this is, of course, the biggest vulnerability. Has been for a long time a source of embarrassment in Taiwan, of course. But I would say that this is just part of the story. There is, I would say, a certain degree of maturity within both pan-green actors in Taiwan, and at least certain segments of the Taiwanese society, the more politically engaged, that this was somehow the price to pay, that the platform that the Trump administration offered to Taiwan was worth it. Sometimes the ignominy, we could say, of dealing with Trump administration, and also especially with its most dramatic events. And for example, there was criticism also by Chinese media in English, interestingly, about the position of the Tsai administration in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. and of course also the Capitol Hill assault. And of course, this is true. The administration is in a position of weakness. It is, of course, a vulnerability that cannot be turned around. But I think that their point is that the Taiwanese society has a latent perception of national security threat compared, for example, even though I'm not a specialist, but I would argue compared to countries like Japan, because the threat is more immediate. And so I would say that there is an overall maturity within both political actors in Taiwan, and at least those sectors of Taiwanese society who are not pro-China and are politically engaged, that ultimately, project an idea that it's worth it. That we know it's that kind of guy. There is a degree of hypocrisy in it, but ultimately we have a very limited range of options, and eventually we could build on that and move forward. Indeed, now. It seems that the situation is actually in the next years with the Biden administration is actually quite good. I mean, of course, there was strong preoccupations about the Biden administration in Taiwan, but we don't know exactly how things will evolve. But now I think that Taiwan could get best of both worlds. It has a more reliable partner and credible partner among Western liberal democracies with the Biden administration, and at the same time, it can continue probably to push for the free and open, for those kind of narratives that I mentioned in the paper. And I also, a small comment on Audrey Tang, I liked that you mentioned him, because I think it's a very interesting point that tells a bit about the dark side of this view and a way in which liberal democratic elements can also be instrumentalized. What I noticed in the research is that Audrey Tang generally tries to present himself as something, as a person, as an actor that sets himself apart from the rest of the government, as a non-political actor. And this may be his own perception, but nonetheless, he still remains the minister of the Tsai administration. And so there is a degree of ambiguity in actually presenting yourself to the outside world, and especially to Western audiences, as just a champion of liberal democracy, of digital democracy, but at the same time, actually being organic to the projection of strategic communications of Taiwan. And for the second question about digital democracy, yeah, there are, of course, deep uncertainty. If we take a look at the kind of civic hackers, civic tech environments of the sunflower movements that are connected to Tang, Audrey Tang is somehow a conduit between these movements and the administration. You see talks about AI, for example, in 50 years being able to solve all the problems of society and politics. There will be no need for representative politics. Everything will be decided to AI. There is this kind of optimism, tech optimism, that I think doesn't really exist much in the West. And so there is a very fraught relations. What does it mean actually, digital society? Is it just a transitionary phase to an AI-ruled democracy? It's still very much unfocused. But I would say there is an interest among, I would say there is some interest among Western countries and Western European countries about this kind of discussions. And I'm thinking about the five-star movements in Italy. That it was in many ways the first type of internet-based populism. And it actually created the platforms similar to the ones that emerged in Taiwan, V-Taiwan. So these bottom-up platforms where people could actually propose their policies and then can be implemented. The result in Italy was a disaster, mostly because it seems, even though it's never been said, that the five-star movements actually was able to manipulate and control the results. They never acknowledged a third party to verify the platform itself, something that instead has been done in Taiwan. But I would say that there is an interest in Western Europe, at least in countries, maybe in specific areas of certain Europe, more open to populism temptations, where maybe the Taiwanese discourse could be interesting. And these are all opens a whole new kind of worm. I think it connects also to the emerging discourse of techno-populism that has been raised in Europe very recently. But I think it's Carlo Invernizzi, the book for Oxford University Press, is just coming out on the topic. I haven't read it yet, but I read his article. But anyway, maybe this is a bit too far from the core of your questions, Peter. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. but there's no question posed from the public, and if I may abuse the power of chair myself and then pose some questions to you speakers, and because this is wonderful presentations, and I really want to. I was quite excited, and if I may I pose one rather conceptual and academic question to Professor Bolt, and one practical questions to Professor Insisa and Professor Aoi. One question, too academic perhaps, to Professor Bolt. About this concept of strategic communication. I learned a lot. I used to learn, but I forgot. I'm sorry to equalize this disinformation and strategic communication at the beginning. But yes, this is more the wider and more relevant conceptualization. Now, what I'm wondering is the scope of this concept, conceptual space, I would say. Because in the traditional international relations, something like the heavily military concept of deterrence, mutual deterrence, is highly strategic and highly communicative in the sense that you need to have the other side's perceptions for sure and so on. But apparently the current focus on this concept of strategic communication is somewhat different. I just wonder to what extent you're borrowing, from the sort of traditional, conceptual tools when you are formulating this, if not, perhaps not new, but the precise concept of strategic communication. This is my rather academic question, and one practical question to other speakers about China. Now, I certainly understood this the shaping activity and so on, but the seeing from this strategic communication viewpoint, how do you assess to what extent China was successful over the say last 10 years in the 2010s? After the Lehman shock, the establishment of AIIB, Belt and Road Initiative, all looked like, it all had the air of success, especially in the appearance of shaping the world and region and so on. So it could be seen as rather successful. But at the same time, if you look at the Taiwanese situation, the Taiwanese people, I lived 8 months there, and then, it's far from, a success in, having a, hearts and minds type of success. So I just wonder, how should I view the same actor, China, in these two different directions? That's my question. So Professor Bolt, sorry, may I ask Professor Aoi to answer first, because you may have to leave soon. Sorry. Or is it too quick, too sudden? Is it? Or should I leave you a little bit later? Or perhaps Professor Bolt and Professor Aoi and Professor Insisa. Is it fine? Okay, Professor Bolt, please.
Thank you. I'll be quick because Shuki has to go. So I don't think that at the start of this century, suddenly a new form of communications appeared on the planet. There's a natural evolution, and there are reasons why an emphasis was placed on the more persuasive element rather than the coercive. Having said that, I don't believe that strategic communications is a binary. Public diplomacy is contained within strategic communications. Public diplomacy understood as the exchange of, let's say, academic, educational, sporting, touristic, even trade relations between states, understood as public diplomacy. And I think that sits within strategic communications, as does the idea of sanctions, which of course very much in the news, not just in the case of Iran, but Russia and now China. Where does it sit? I think sanctions is quite an offensive weapon to use. And you mentioned deterrence, military deterrence. Within strategic communications, I believe that the threat of the use of military force is always on the table, even if it's ignored. You don't have to talk about it for it still to be in the room. And so it's not a simple either or. I think it is the minute by minute calibration of different tools or different aspects of communication that states and also non-state actors use towards each other. So that to see things purely in terms of crisis communications, immediate communications, 24, 48, 72-hour communications on the one hand, versus strategic communications about the next 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years, I think is also misleading. Strategic communications contains within it parallel timelines that are actually mutually informing each other.
That's interesting, and thanks for the clarification. Thank you. Professor Insisa, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Endo. I think that, if the crux of the question ultimately is to what extent Chinese strategic communications have been effective in Taiwan, towards Taiwan, I would say that there are two answers. One is the straightforward one. That is that after the failure of the economic comprehensive framework agreement-driven process of cross-strait economic integration between 2014 and 2015, that essentially there was no success, because China has not been able to establish a new Taiwan policy that could actually be sold by the KMT, in this case, to the Taiwanese electorate. And so there's a problem of narrative. It is the straightforward question. So there isn't actually, because China refuses to engage, to reformulate a narrative and a strategy that emerged in the mid-2000s, there is no success. And it is the straightforward answer. But I would say that there's also a second answer that kind of complicates this narrative, because in fact, if we take a look at the electoral dynamics of Taiwan, especially throughout 2018, we see that the KMT was on road to win with a populist. Han Kuo-yu was essentially very close to the mainland, that the Taiwanese electorate was fed up with Tsai Ing-wen, mostly for domestic reasons. But there is meaning in the fact that he was willing to endorse politicians on the pan-blue side. And it's been only with a very forceful and tailored to domestic audiences speech that Xi Jinping gave on the 1st of January 2019 that the climate started to change in Taiwan and turned against China, and specifically turned against pan-blue actors who were more open to relations with China. And then the real sea change occurred, of course, with the Hong Kong protests. That really, unfortunately for Beijing, I'm here in Hong Kong, of course, here. Unfortunately for Beijing, have damaged the prospects of reunification. But before 2019, somehow China was still able, and political actors close to China were still able to have a prospect towards actually regaining the presidency, and maybe even gaining a majority in the legislative yuan. And that would have completely changed the dynamic. So I think that this is quite important to keep in mind. It's easy to think that everything changed when with the Sunflower Movement and the end of the cross-strait service trade agreement and Tsai Ing-wen victory. But we shouldn't forget that it was was an open road by 2018. And things have truly changed only in 2019. So two different answers, let's say.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid time is up, but I'm so grateful for you all. These are all powerful, and then I learned a lot. Thank you very much indeed. So we close the session. Thank you.